She did not scream. That was the strangest part. The part she would replay for 7 long years afterward, in the quiet hours before dawn when the past refused to stay buried. She simply stood frozen in the doorway of the bedchamber, her hand gripping the cold mahogany frame, watching golden lamplight fall across tangled silken sheets, across her own sister's blonde hair spilled over his pillow, across the man she was meant to marry in 48 hours. The fire in the hearth burned low. Neither of them saw her at first. Not the sister she had trusted with every secret of her heart. Not the fiancé she had planned to spend her whole life beside. She said nothing. She did not wake the house, did not demand answers, did not let a single sound escape her. She simply stepped back into the corridor and closed the door with a click so quiet it sounded like a dying breath. She stripped the diamond ring from her finger, left it gleaming on a silver tray by the grand staircase, and walked out into the freezing midnight rain without a coat, without a bag, without one backward glance. What she never told him, what she carried alone into the fog of a hidden valley town, into a life built entirely from scratch, was that she was already carrying his son. Hello, lovely. Before we step into tonight's world of slow burn romance and quiet longing, where are you joining us from? Are you watching from Australia, Ireland, South Africa, or Greece? And to everyone across the United States, whether you are in Kansas City, Lansing, northern Wisconsin, Virginia, Massachusetts, Texas, or anywhere else in this beautiful country, this story is for you. Drop your location in the comments. I read every single one, and it makes this feel like a shared journey across time zones and night skies. If slow burn romance is your thing, please like and subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories like this one. Now settle in. For 7 years, the world believed Lynn B. Jackson was dead. There had been no scandal announced, no explanation offered, only a vanished bride 2 days before her wedding, a diamond ring abandoned on a silver tray, and a grieving household too humiliated to search very hard for the truth. She had left everything behind: her name, her family, her place among society's most envied women, and the man she had trusted more than her own reflection. What she carried instead, into a secluded fog-wrapped valley in Maine, was a secret far heavier than heartbreak. In a quiet town called Oakhaven, under the borrowed name Sarah Clark, she built a life stitched together from nothing, and raised a boy with unmistakable hazel eyes, the exact shade of a duke who had no idea he existed. Now, 7 years later, that duke has finally traced her to the one place she thought no one would ever find her, carrying a truth of his own that could unravel everything she believed about the night she ran, and a discovery that will change both their lives forever. The fog rolled through Oakhaven most mornings the way memory rolled through Lynn's mind, slow, quiet, and impossible to outrun. She had learned, over 7 years, to move through it the same way she moved through everything else now, with her head down, her hands busy, and her heart carefully, deliberately closed. Sarah Clark's tailor shop sat at the crooked bend where Main Street dipped toward the harbor, its window fogged with morning breath and lined with bolts of wool and gingham instead of the silks she once knew by touch alone. The bell above the door still needed oiling. She'd been meaning to fix it for a month. There was always something more urgent: a hem to finish, a coat to mend before the cold set in, a small boy to feed before school. Jimmy was already at the table when she came downstairs, swinging his legs against the chair, spooning porridge with the distracted energy of a child who had somewhere better to be. He was 7 now, all elbows and unstoppable questions, and when he looked up at her, really looked up, the way he did most mornings without meaning to break her heart, she saw it again. The eyes. Not brown like hers, not blue like Linda's. Hazel, flecked with gold at the center, the exact color she'd spent 7 years trying not to remember and had instead been given a living reminder of every single day. Mama, will you teach me to sew a real seam today? Not the wobbly kind. Every seam starts wobbly, Jimmy. She smoothed his hair, dark and unruly, and pressed a kiss to his forehead before he could squirm away from it. Even mine did. It wasn't entirely true. She had been sewing since she was younger than him, though not out of necessity. Back then it had been an accomplishment, something ladies did with their idle hands between visits and dress fittings. Now it was survival, and she had never been more grateful for a skill in her life. Oakhaven didn't ask questions of the widow who'd arrived 7 years ago with nothing but a small trunk and a baby on the way. Or if it did, it had long since stopped. Thomas Miller at the mill nodded to her every morning like clockwork. Mrs. Abbott at the bakery saved her the good bread. The town had folded her in without prying at the seams of her story, and for that alone, Lynn, Sarah, she reminded herself, always Sarah now, would have stayed forever. She latched the shop door behind Jimmy as he ran off toward the schoolhouse, his coat, her handiwork, 3 winters old, still holding, flapping behind him. The fog was lifting off the harbor, slow and silver, and somewhere beneath the quiet of another ordinary morning, she let herself believe, as she did every day, that the life she'd built here was solid enough to never be shaken again. She had no way of knowing how wrong she was. It was Mrs. Abbott who mentioned it first, setting a paper-wrapped loaf on the counter with the particular relish of a woman who lived for news in a town that rarely produced any. "A gentleman's taken the best room at the inn," she said, eyes bright. "Arrived last night in a carriage finer than anything Oakhaven's seen since old Judge Whitfield passed. Wouldn't say his business. Just paid Ezra a fortnight in advance and asked after the town's families." She leaned in, lowering her voice as though the wool bolts might repeat it. Asked after new families, particular, ones that came from away. Lynn's hands stilled over the fabric she'd been folding. "Did he now? Handsome, too, if you don't mind my saying. Hard sort of handsome, though? Like he hasn't smiled proper in years." Mrs. Abbott shrugged, already losing interest, already moving toward the door. "Probably some lawyer chasing an inheritance. You know how these things go." Lynn did not know how these things went, but something in her chest had gone cold and very still, the way it used to when she heard a particular footstep on the corridor outside her old bedroom, back when footsteps still meant something to fear. She told herself it was nothing. Oakhaven saw the occasional stranger, merchants, surveyors, once a photographer who'd stayed a week photographing the harbor at dawn. There was no reason a well-dressed man asking idle questions at an inn should feel like the floor tilting beneath her feet. She almost believed herself until she saw him. It was 2 days later, a gray Tuesday with rain threatening, when she glanced up from her work table toward the shop window and saw him crossing the street outside, tall, dark-coated, moving with the unhurried authority of a man who had never once in his life had to wonder whether a room would make space for him. He paused outside the bakery, turned his head, scanning the row of shops the way a man might read a page he was determined not to miss a single word of. And then she saw his face. The porridge spoon Jimmy had left on the counter that morning clattered to the floor before she realized her own hand had knocked it there. 7 years. 7 years, and she had told herself, on the worst nights, that she was remembering him wrong, that memory softened and hardened faces in equal measure, that no man's eyes could really be that particular shade of searching, that hollowed, hardened green gold she'd spent a lifetime trying to forget. But there he was, older, harder around the jaw, the same unmistakable eyes that haunted her most every time she looked at her own son. Shane. She stepped back from the window so fast her spine hit the shelf behind her, sending a bolt of blue surge tumbling to the floorboards, and for one long, suspended moment, Sarah Clark ceased to exist entirely, and Lynn B. Jackson stood frozen in a tailor shop in Oakhaven, exactly the way she had frozen in a doorway 7 years before, caught, cornered, and utterly unable to move. The bell above the door, the one she'd never gotten around to oiling, rang out sharp and sudden, and Lynn didn't need to turn around to know who had walked in. She felt it the way she used to feel a change in weather, some old instinct in her blood recognizing him before her eyes ever confirmed it. She turned anyway. There was no version of this moment she could run from. Shane stood just inside the doorway, and for a long, breathless second neither of them moved. He looked different than she remembered, the softness gone from his face, replaced by something leaner, more weathered, a man who had clearly spent years being rained on in places that weren't kind to dukes. But the eyes were exactly the same. Jimmy's eyes. She had to grip the edge of the work table to keep from swaying at the sight of them. She braced for anger. She had imagined this moment 100 times over 7 years. Imagined fury, accusation, the cold aristocratic disdain she'd once feared more than anything. She had never once imagined what actually happened. His face broke, not into rage, but into something raw and undone, something she hadn't seen on him even in their most private moments together. His shoulders dropped as though a weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten its size had finally been set down. Lynn, her real name, spoken for the first time in 7 years, landed in the small shop like something sacred. God, Lynn, you're alive. Don't, she said, though her voice shook on the single word. Don't come in here and say my name like. I searched every port town on this coast. He stepped forward, and she saw now that his hands were trembling, that whatever composure he'd walked in with was cracking apart in real time. 7 years, Lynn. I told myself if I ever found you, I'd have the good sense to stay calm, to explain everything properly, and instead he exhaled unsteady. I thought you were dead. For the first 2 years, I genuinely believed the sea had taken you, and I have never in my life felt anything like the relief of seeing you standing in this room right now. You have no right to relief. The words came out sharper than she intended, years of buried grief finding an edge. I saw you. I saw both of you, in that bed, 2 days before. I know what you saw. His voice cracked. And I have spent every day since trying to prove it wasn't what you think. Please, Lynn, just 5 minutes. Let me tell you the truth. I should have chased you into the rain to tell you, that very night. She should have sent him away. Every instinct that had kept her safe for 7 years told her to point him back through the door and lock it behind him. Instead, she found herself pulling out the small wooden chair across from her work table, the same one Jimmy sat in each morning, and gesturing for Shane to take it, because some traitorous part of her still needed to hear whatever he'd crossed an ocean of years to say. He sat like a man and used to chairs that creaked, hands folded tight on the table between them, as though holding himself together by force. That night, he began. I remember almost nothing after the second glass of wine. That should have told me something was wrong from the start. I have never in my life lost an evening to drink, and I didn't that night either. Not naturally. He looked up at her, and the shame in his face was old, worn smooth from years of turning the same memory over. Linda drugged it, Lynn. She'd been in debt for over a year, gambling debts, deep enough to ruin her. Deep enough that our family's name was the only thing standing between her and disaster. She needed a marriage, a title, and she'd decided mine would do. Lynn's hands had gone very still on the table. You're telling me my own sister. I didn't understand it myself until months later, when her creditors started coming to my solicitors instead of hers, when the pieces I should have seen sooner finally fit together. His jaw tightened. I rejected her. Whatever she intended that night, whatever she thought would happen once the drug took hold, I remember refusing her before I lost consciousness entirely. I remember that much clearly. But by the time I woke, you were already gone, and there was no explanation I could offer that didn't sound exactly like what a guilty man would say. So you let me believe it. Her voice was quiet, and worse for its quiet. For 7 years. I didn't let you do anything. I searched for you the moment I understood what I'd find myself, and I found nothing. No trace, no word, nothing but a ring on a silver tray and a household too ashamed to admit their daughter had vanished into the rain. He reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, stopping just short as though he'd finally learned, somewhere in 7 years, not to take what wasn't offered. I'm not asking you to forgive it tonight. I'm only asking you to believe that I never stopped looking, and that whatever you built here, I never meant to be the reason you had to build it alone. Outside, the fog had rolled back in, and somewhere beyond the shop window, the schoolhouse bell was ringing the children out for the afternoon. She hadn't planned for him to meet Jimmy. Not that day, not that week, perhaps not for a long while yet. There were things she still needed to understand herself before she handed her son a truth that large. But Oakhaven was a small town, and small towns had a way of making plans on their own. Jimmy came barreling up the porch steps at his usual hour, satchel bouncing, cheeks pink from the cold, already talking before the door had fully opened. Mama, Thomas said the mill will finally. He stopped short at the sight of the stranger standing near the porch rail, and for a moment he simply stared, the unfiltered assessment of a 7-year-old sizing up something unfamiliar. Lynn's heart climbed into her throat. She watched Shane go very still, watched something move across his face that she recognized instantly, because she'd felt it herself the day Jimmy was born. The particular shock of seeing your own eyes looking back at you from a face you'd never met. Hello, Shane said, and his voice had lost every trace of the polished, aristocratic ease she remembered. It came out rough, careful, like a man testing ice he wasn't sure would hold his weight. Jimmy did not return the greeting. Jimmy was looking at his coat. It was, admittedly, a formidable coat, heavy dark wool, a high collar, the kind of expensive tailoring Oakhaven simply didn't produce. Jimmy tilted his head, considering it with the grave seriousness he brought to all his most important questions. Is that coat so big because you're a pirate? Lynn nearly dropped the basket of mending in her arms. She saw Shane blink, caught entirely off guard, and for one suspended second, she genuinely didn't know what would happen. Whether the Duke of Westmere, a man raised on decorum and composure since before he could walk, would know how to answer a 7-year-old's question about piracy. Then Shane laughed. It was not the practiced, measured laugh she remembered from ballrooms and dinner tables. It came out of him loud and sudden and completely unguarded, a real laugh, the kind that cracked something open in his face and left it younger, looser, more like the man she'd fallen in love with before any of this had happened. He knelt right there on the porch boards, bringing himself down to Jimmy's height, still laughing. "No," he said, "though I'll admit, no one's ever asked me that before. It's just a coat for cold weather. Though if you like, I could tell you a very good story about pirates, if your mother doesn't object." Jimmy turned to her immediately, eyes wide with hope. "Mama, can he?" Lynn stood frozen in the doorway, watching the two of them. The same jaw, she realized now, seeing them side by side. The same stubborn set to the eyebrows, and felt something in her chest, guarded so carefully for 7 long years, begin, against every instinct she had, to loosen. "Just one story," she heard herself say. Lynn expected him to press his advantage. That was what men of his station did, in her experience, found an opening and widened it until it swallowed everything else. She braced herself for carriages arranged without her consent, for talk of returning to Westmere, for the quiet, relentless pressure of a man used to getting what he wanted. Instead, Shane stayed at the inn and did nothing of the kind. He didn't ask her to leave. He didn't ask to see Jimmy again the next morning, though she caught him twice walking slowly past the shop window, hands in his pockets, looking like a man deliberately keeping himself at a respectful distance. When she finally asked him, 3 days later, what exactly he intended to do, he'd given her an answer she hadn't expected at all. "Whatever you'll allow," he said. Nothing more. What he did instead was walk down to the old logging mill at the edge of town, the one that had collapsed under a bad storm 2 winters back, the one half of Oakhaven had grumbled about for months without anyone having the coin or the manpower to properly rebuild it, and simply started working. Thomas Miller, who ran the mill and who had appointed himself, without ever saying so aloud, the unofficial guardian of the widow Clark and her boy, did not take kindly to it at first. "Fine coat for mill work," Thomas said flatly, the first morning, watching Shane roll up sleeves that had clearly never touched raw timber in their life. "It'll survive," Shane said, and picked up a beam anyway. He was slow at it, clumsy in the way of a man who'd spent his whole life being served rather than serving, and Lynn heard later, from Mrs. Abbott, who heard it from her husband, who heard it from half the men at the mill, that he'd split his palm open on the second day and hadn't said a word about it, just wrapped it in his own shirt sleeve, and kept working until sundown. Weeks passed. The mill wheel rose again, plank by plank, and so, gradually, did something in Thomas Miller's guarded opinion of the stranger. Lynn watched it happen from a careful distance. The nod that came a little easier, the conversations that stretched a little longer. The afternoon she saw Thomas hand Shane a mug of cider without being asked, which in Oakhaven was as good as a formal declaration of trust. "He's not what I expected," Thomas admitted to her one evening, gruff and unwilling to say more than that. Lynn only nodded, watching Shane through the shop window as he walked back toward the inn in the fading light, coat over his shoulder, hands roughened in a way they'd never been in the life she'd left behind, and found she didn't entirely disagree. The letter arrived on an otherwise unremarkable Thursday, delivered to the inn by a courier who'd clearly ridden hard to reach Oakhaven, and Shane knew before he'd even broken the seal that whatever waited inside would not be good news. He recognized the handwriting immediately, precise, slanted, deliberately elegant in the way of a man who'd spent his whole life trying to look more important than he was. Arthur Vance. Shane read it once standing in the doorway of his room, and then again seated, because the first reading hadn't fully landed, hadn't yet settled into the cold, sick certainty that this was exactly as bad as it appeared. My dear cousin, it began, with the particular false warmth Arthur reserved for letters meant to wound. It has come to my attention, through sources I trust implicitly, that you have taken up curious residence in a small valley town, and that your interest there extends to a woman and, more curiously still, a boy of some 7 years. I need not remind you what the family, the title, and certain interested parties in London would make of a bastard child suddenly emerging to complicate the succession. I am, as ever, a reasonable man. I am prepared to keep this matter entirely private, for a price we might discuss at your earliest convenience. Should you decline, I assure you the coast will hear of it before you've had the chance to pack your trunks. Your loving cousin, Arthur. Shane's hand tightened around the paper until it crumpled. He had known, distantly, that Arthur had been watching his movements. Arthur watched everyone's movements, always calculating angles, always circling whatever inheritance might one day fall within his reach if enough scandal cleared the path. But he had let himself believe, foolishly, that Oakhaven was far enough removed from that world to stay untouched by it. He thought of Jimmy on the porch, asking about pirates. He thought of Lynn, finally beginning to let her guard down after 7 years of carrying this alone, finally allowing herself something close to peace. Arthur would take all of it apart with the same casual precision he used to plan every advantageous move of his life. A public accusation, a legitimacy contested in every drawing room and gossip column on the coast. Jimmy's name dragged through scandal before he was even old enough to understand what the word meant. Shane folded the letter once, twice, his jaw tight with a fury he hadn't felt in 7 years. Not since the night he'd woken from Linda's wine to find his entire life in ruins. He would not let it happen again. Not to Jimmy. Not to Lynn. He rose from the chair, already reaching for his coat, already knowing exactly where he needed to go first. Not to Lynn. Not yet. But to his solicitor, to the family records buried in Westmere's archives, to every scrap of proof he would need to make certain Arthur Vance never got the chance to make good on a single word of that threat. Arthur Vance arrived at Westmere unannounced, which should have told Lynn everything she needed to know about the sort of man he was before he'd said a single word. She had come to the estate at Shane's request, cautious but willing. Jimmy left safely in Oakhaven with Mrs. Abbott for the week, while she and Shane worked through what needed to be settled. She hadn't expected to find herself alone in the bedchamber when Arthur let himself in without knocking, closing the door behind him with a deliberate, unhurried click that made her stomach turn cold. "So you're the seamstress," he said, looking her over the way a man appraises livestock. "I confess, I expected someone rather less plain. Then again, I suppose desperation isn't particular about its comforts. I don't believe we've been introduced." Her voice came out steadier than she felt, though her hands, clasped tight in front of her, betrayed the truth of it. "We don't need to be. I know precisely who you are, and precisely what your boy stands to cost this family if you don't see sense." He stepped closer, and something in his flat, calculating expression made her back toward the bed frame instinctively, the old fear rising in her chest before she could stop it. "A quiet settlement. You disappear back to your valley, richer than you deserve, and the boy's little claim to anything Westmere never sees daylight. Refuse me, and I promise you, every newspaper on this coast will. That's quite enough." Shane's voice cut through the room like a blade, and Lynn had never in her life been so grateful for a sound. He stood in the doorway, and whatever composure he'd shown at the mill, on the porch, across her work table, was entirely absent now. What remained was cold, precise fury. "Get away from her, Arthur." "Cousin, I was merely. I know exactly what you were doing." Shane crossed the room and placed himself deliberately between them, and Lynn felt the shift in the air the moment he did, felt 7 years of fear loosen its grip, just slightly. He produced a folded set of documents from inside his coat and held them out, not to Arthur's hand, but simply into the space between them, forcing Arthur to reach for what he'd been so desperate to prevent existing at all. "Certified medical testimony from 2 physicians confirming the substance found in my blood the night you and Linda staged your little scheme. Sworn statements from her own creditors, dated and notarized. And the entailment provisions our grandfather wrote into this family's charter, which you would know, if you'd ever bothered reading them. Name any child of my blood as legitimate heir regardless of the circumstances of their birth. Arthur's face had drained of all its earlier smugness. You have no case, Arthur. You never did. What you have is 7 years of watching a door you thought might open for you, and I'm here to close it permanently. Shane's voice didn't rise, didn't need to. Leave Westmere tonight, or I'll see every one of these documents in the hands of the family solicitor by morning, and you can explain your gambling debts and Linda's fraud to the entire coast yourself. Arthur left without another word. Lynn, still trembling, felt Shane's hand find hers, steady, certain, entirely unlike the boy who'd once let her walk into the rain alone. Spring came late to Oakhaven that year, but when it arrived all at once. Fog burning off the harbor earlier each morning, the valley greening in a rush, as though the whole town had simply been waiting for permission to bloom. Lynn stood at her shop window, watching Jimmy chase Thomas Miller's dog down the lane, and thought, not for the first time that season, that she had spent 7 years mistaking survival for peace. She had built something real here, and would never regret it. But there was a difference between the life she'd built to protect herself and the life she actually wanted, and it had taken watching Shane split his palm on mill timber, kneel on her porch steps laughing about pirates, and stand between her and Arthur Vance without hesitation, to understand which one she was truly living. He asked her on the porch, of all places, no grand estate, no audience, just the two of them and the gold light of a valley evening. I'm not asking you to become a duchess, he said, turning a small, plain ring in his fingers. I'm asking Sarah Clark, seamstress of Oakhaven, whether she'll have me. Whatever that requires, staying here, dividing our time, Jimmy growing up between two worlds, I'll build it around your choice. I lost 7 years assuming I understood what you needed. I won't make that mistake twice. Taking the ring from his hand felt like the first choice she'd made entirely for herself in longer than she could remember. They married in June, in the small stone church at the edge of the valley, sunlight pouring through windows too old and simple for grandeur, exactly as Lynn wanted. Thomas Miller stood in his good coat. Mrs. Abbott dabbed her eyes through the whole ceremony, the close-knit fabric of a town that had sheltered her without ever demanding to know why. Jimmy stood beside them at the altar, hazel eyes bright, unbothered by the fact that he was, as of that morning, heir to a dukedom he'd only just learned existed. She had not screamed the night she lost everything. She did not need to now, standing in sunlight, having chosen, at last, exactly the life she wanted. Hello, lovely. Before we close the door on tonight's story of betrayal, silence, and the love that found its way back through 7 long years, where did you watch it from? Were you tucked in somewhere in Canada, England, New Zealand, or the Philippines? And to everyone across the United States watching tonight, whether you're in Seattle, Nashville, Ohio, the Carolinas, Colorado, or anywhere else this story found you, Lynn and Shane's journey was for you too. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I read every single one, and there's something quietly beautiful about knowing this story reached so many different corners of the world tonight, different time zones, different night skies, all gathered around the same, slow-burning ending. If you found yourself holding your breath through that bedchamber scene, or smiling at a boy asking a duke if his coat made him a pirate, let me know which moment stayed with you. And if stories like this, the kind that ache a little before they heal, are the ones you come back for, please like, comment, and subscribe. It's the simplest way to help me keep bringing you more of them. Until next time, lovely. Sleep well, and thank you for choosing this crown with me tonight.